David Chen has been working as a civilian engineer at the Human Thessari Joint Research Facility for 8 months, and he has learned through consistent experience that when Ambassador Webb suggests something in his deliberately casual way, "You should join me for dinner. There's someone interesting I'd like you to meet." What sounds like professional networking opportunity is almost certainly more complicated than the initial description suggests. But David accepted the invitation because Ambassador Webb has been helpful with navigating the cultural complexities of working in joint facility, and because meeting someone interesting could legitimately mean professional connection that might benefit his engineering work, even if it also means whatever social complication Webb is carefully not explaining. The restaurant is in the Thessari civilian district, upscale establishment that caters to both Thessari and human clientele, known for excellent food and private dining areas that allow for conversation without the ambient noise that larger dining spaces produce. David arrives at the designated time, provides his name to the host, and is directed to one of the private dining areas, a comfortable space with a table for two, pleasant lighting, windows overlooking a garden area, the kind of setting that's appropriate for business dinner or for other kinds of meetings. He enters the dining area and immediately understands that this is not professional networking dinner. Commander Kethara is waiting at the table. David recognizes her from facility briefings, senior Thessari military officer, decorated combat veteran, currently serving as liaison between Thessari Military Command and the Joint Research Facility's Defense Applications Division. She's impressive even in the formal military context where David has seen her before. Tall, carrying herself with the kind of authority that decades of military service produce, speaking with precision and confidence that command positions require. She's even more impressive in civilian attire, elegant dress that's formal enough for upscale restaurant, but that's clearly chosen for aesthetic rather than for military protocol. Her bearing still communicating authority, but softened slightly by the non-military context. David experiences the immediate awkward recognition that this is a blind date. That Ambassador Webb's, "Someone interesting I'd like you to meet," was diplomatic phrasing for "I'm setting you up on a date with a Thessari military commander without telling you in advance, because if I'd told you it was a date you might have declined. And I think you two might actually get along well enough that the setup is worth the initial awkwardness." Kethara's expression suggests she's experiencing similar recognition, that whatever Ambassador Webb told her about this dinner, it probably wasn't explicit about it being a blind date either. "Mr. Chen," Kethara says, standing to offer formal greeting. "I believe Ambassador Webb may have been strategically imprecise about the nature of this dinner invitation when he spoke with both of us." "That's diplomatic way of saying we've been set up," David agrees, accepting the greeting. "I apologize if this is awkward. I can leave if you prefer not to." "Sit," Kethara says, and it's not quite a command, but it's definitely spoken with the authority of someone accustomed to having her directions followed. "We're both here. The food at this establishment is excellent, and Ambassador Webb clearly put effort into arranging this meeting. The least we can do is share a meal before deciding whether his matchmaking instincts were completely misguided." David sits, appreciating both her directness and her pragmatism. If you're going to be set up on a blind date you didn't know you were agreeing to, might as well approach it practically rather than making it more awkward by either of them fleeing immediately. "I should mention," Kethara continues, her skin showing colors that David has learned indicate mild amusement, "that this dinner may be slightly more complicated than Ambassador Webb intended." "Complicated how?" David asks. Kethara gestures subtly toward the dining area's periphery and the adjacent spaces visible through windows. "My daughters insisted on being present." David follows her gesture and notices, for the first time, what he'd initially overlooked, while processing the awkward blind date recognition. There are Thessari girls at various positions throughout the dining area and the adjacent garden space, not eating together at a family table, not obviously with Kethara, but definitely there, and definitely watching. 6 of them, David counts as his awareness catches up with what his eyes have been seeing without fully registering. Ranging in age from what appears to be early childhood to mid-teens based on Thessari developmental patterns, David has learned to recognize from working at the joint facility. All of them showing the same distinctive facial structure, the particular ear shape, the specific patterns in their skin color variations, the subtle similarities that mark family relationship even across the significant size differences between a 7-year-old and a 16-year-old. Your daughters, David says slowly, processing the implications. They're here, watching this dinner. They're here evaluating whether the human their mother agreed to have dinner with is remotely acceptable. Kethara corrects with the kind of amused exasperation that parents develop when their children are being both protective and impossible to argue with. Thessari military families are protective when their mother agrees to a blind date arranged by a human diplomat they've never met. They tend to want to assess the situation personally. David looks at the 6 daughters positioned strategically throughout the space. One at a nearby table pretending to read but clearly listening to their conversation. One at the bar area where she can observe facial expressions and body language. One in the garden visible through the window. One at a corner table with clear sightlines. 2 younger ones at tables closer to the play area but both frequently glancing toward their mother's table. They're not hostile, not creating disruption, not making the surveillance obvious except to someone who's now aware it's happening, but they are absolutely, thoroughly watching, evaluating, assessing the human who's having dinner with their mother. So this blind date, David observes, comes with 6 chaperones who are also judges, jury, and probably executioners if I say or do something they disapprove of. Kethara's skin shows deeper amusement. That's reasonably accurate summary. I apologize for the added complexity. I did tell them they were being ridiculous and that they should trust their mother to handle a simple dinner without supervision. They responded that trust is earned through observation and that they'd be happy to trust my judgment after they'd verified it was sound. That's actually kind of reasonable when you phrase it that way, David admits. My daughters are many things, Kethara says. Unreasonable is rarely one of them, which makes it very difficult to argue with them when they're being protective in ways that are technically logical even if they're also thoroughly embarrassing. She signals the server. We might as well order. I assume you're staying despite the surveillance. David considers the situation. He's on a blind date he didn't know he was agreeing to, with a decorated Thessari military commander, who comes with 6 daughters who are currently evaluating whether he's acceptable company for their mother. It's possibly the most complicated first date scenario he's ever encountered. It's also kind of fascinating. I'm staying, David confirms. Though I should warn you that I'm probably going to be terrible at this given the pressure of performing for an audience of 6 protective daughters, in addition to trying to make decent first impression on you. Then don't perform, Kethara suggests. Be yourself. My daughters aren't looking for polished social performance. They're looking for genuine character. Honesty will serve you better than confidence with them. Noted, David says. Though that might be the most intimidating first date advice I've ever received. Kethara smiles. Welcome to dinner with a Thessari military family, Mr. Chen. I hope Ambassador Webb's faith in his matchmaking instincts proves justified. The server takes their orders, David choosing something from the human-compatible section of the menu. Kethara ordering a Thessari dish that David doesn't recognize, but that sounds impressive when she describes it. The ordering process is blessedly normal, a brief respite from the awareness that 6 pairs of eyes are tracking every interaction. Once the server departs, Kethara provides what sounds like prepared explanation, probably rehearsed with her daughters before David's arrival. I should introduce you to your evaluators, since they're going to be present for the entire dinner whether we acknowledge them or not. Starting with the eldest. She gestures subtly toward the nearby table where a teenage Thessari girl is pretending to read. That's Seris. 16 years old, appointed herself chief defender of family honor and personal assessor of anyone who might be interested in her mother. She's listening to every word we say and will have detailed critique prepared for later. But Seris doesn't look up from her reading device, but her skin colors shift slightly in acknowledgement that she's been identified. At the bar, Kethara continues, is Mara, 14. She's studying human behavioral psychology and considers this an excellent opportunity to observe cross-species social dynamics. She's watching your body language, facial expressions, and microreactions with what I'm certain is thorough documentation for later analysis. Mara makes brief eye contact and returns what might be a professional nod, researcher acknowledging research subject. In the garden, trying to appear casual while actually maintaining perfect surveillance position, is Vela. 11 years old, already showing tactical aptitude that would make her excellent military strategist. She's analyzing how you respond to awareness of being watched and how you adapt your behavior under observation. Vela, visible through the window, is indeed positioned where she can observe while appearing to simply enjoy the garden. The corner table with the strategy board game, Kethara says, is Thessa, 9 years old. She's evaluating your patience, watching how you handle the interruptions and complications that her sisters will inevitably create. She's also playing a genuinely complex strategy game while conducting her assessment, which tells you something about her capacity for multitasking. Thessa moves a game piece while simultaneously glancing at their table, demonstrating exactly the multitasking Kethara described. At the table closer to the play area, drawing but frequently watching, Kethara continues, is Kira, 8 years old. She's testing your kindness. She'll probably approach at some point to show you her art or ask questions, and she'll be evaluating how you respond to a child seeking your attention. Kira looks up from her drawing, makes direct eye contact with David, and returns to her artwork with the satisfied air of someone who just completed an observation. And the youngest, Kethara concludes, is Lyra, 7 years old. She's in the play area but has already made 3 appearances to check on Mother and will likely make several more. She's assessing your gentleness, watching how you interact with the smallest and youngest member of the family. She's also completely fearless about approaching strangers, which both serves her assessment goals and occasionally terrifies me. As if on cue, Lyra appears beside the table. Mother is the human nice. He looks nice. Can I ask him questions? After dinner, Lyra, Kethara says with patient firmness. Mr. Chen and I are having conversation right now. But I have important questions, Lyra objects. They can wait 30 minutes, Kethara replies. Go back to the play area. I promise you'll have opportunity to interrogate him later. Lyra studies David with the direct, unfiltered assessment that young children specialize in. Then she nods and returns to the play area, apparently satisfied that 30 minutes is acceptable delay for her interrogation. Your daughters are. David searches for diplomatic phrasing. Thorough. Kethara suggests. Protective. Impossible to discourage once they've decided something needs their attention. I was going to say, clearly very invested in their mother's well-being, David says. Which is actually kind of touching even if it's also extremely intimidating from my perspective. It's both, Kethara confirms. Their father died in military action 7 years ago. They've been protective of me since then in ways that are sometimes appropriate and sometimes excessive. Tonight definitely falls into the excessive category, but I couldn't convince them to stay home. I'm sorry about your husband, David says quietly. Thank you, Kethara acknowledges. It's been 7 years. We've adapted. but the adaptation includes my daughters being more vigilant about anyone who might become part of their mother's life than they would be if their father were still alive. She pauses, which brings us to the awkward conversation that blind dates typically require. Ambassador Webb suggested this dinner. I agreed partially because I respect his judgment, and partially because I haven't socialized outside military contexts in approximately 7 years, and my daughters have been increasingly insistent that I should. What brought you to this dinner, Mr. Chen? Please call me David, he says. And honestly, I thought it was professional networking. Ambassador Webb said he wanted me to meet someone interesting. I assumed it was going to be a Thessari researcher or military officer who might have relevant expertise for my engineering work. I didn't realize it was a date until I walked in and saw the whole situation. So you're here under false pretenses, Kethara observes. We both are, David points out. I'm assuming Webb was similarly vague with you about what kind of dinner this was. He told me it would be a casual meal with a human civilian who works at the joint facility, and who might appreciate conversation with someone outside his usual professional circles, Kethara admits. He did not mention the word date, the concept of romantic interest, or the fact that he was apparently matchmaking rather than facilitating professional connection. So we've both been expertly manipulated by a diplomat who decided we should meet, and who knew that if he told either of us it was actually a date we'd probably decline, David summarizes. Accurate, Kethara agrees. The question is whether we're annoyed enough at the manipulation to leave, or interested enough despite the setup to see whether Webb's instincts have any validity. David glances at the 6 daughters maintaining their surveillance. Seris is still pretending to read. Mara is still observing from the bar. Vela is still maintaining her garden position. Thessa is still playing her strategy game. Kira is still drawing. Lyra is back in the play area but clearly watching for the 30 minutes to expire so she can begin her interrogation. I'm interested, David says honestly. Partly because I'm curious whether Webb was right that we'd get along. Partly because this is the most unusual first date I've ever been on, and I kind of want to see how it develops. And partly because any woman whose daughters are this protective and this strategically competent is probably someone worth getting to know. Kethara's skin shows pleased gold. That's good answer. Honest, self-aware, and acknowledges the situation rather than pretending the surveillance isn't happening. You've just earned points with at least 3 of my daughters, possibly all 6 depending on their individual evaluation criteria. Only 3 confirmed, David asks. The teenagers are harder to impress, Kethara explains. They have more sophisticated assessment frameworks and higher standards for what constitutes acceptable character. The younger ones are more willing to grant provisional approval based on honesty and apparent kindness. Seris and Mara will require more data before rendering judgment. Their food arrives. The conversation shifts to safer topics: David's engineering work, Kethara's military service, the challenges of human Thessari cultural integration at the joint facility. It's pleasant discussion, the kind that first dates are supposed to involve when they're not complicated by 6 watchful daughters. But David is acutely aware that every word, every gesture, every response is being observed and evaluated by 6 protective children who are determining whether this human stranger is worthy of their mother's time and attention. Approximately 20 minutes into dinner, Seris happens to walk past the table on her way to somewhere. She pauses beside her mother's chair. "Mother, do you need anything? Is everything acceptable?" The questions are ostensibly directed at Kethara, but Seris's gaze is locked on David, assessing his reaction to the interruption and protective inquiry. "Everything is fine, Seris," Kethara says with patient firmness. "You can return to your table." "I just wanted to make sure the human," Seris begins. "Mr. Chen," Kethara corrects. "His name is David Chen. Use it." "I wanted to make sure Mr. Chen understands that our family values respect and honesty," Seris says, delivering what sounds like prepared statement. "And that we notice when people are being performative versus when they're being genuine." "I'll keep that in mind," David says, meeting Seris's direct gaze without flinching. "Thank you for the clarification." Seris studies him for a moment longer, then nods and returns to her table, apparently satisfied that she's delivered her warning and assessed his response to direct challenge. "Sorry," Kethara says once Seris is out of earshot. She's 16, she's protective, and she's absolutely convinced that anyone interested in her mother must have ulterior motives that require thorough investigation. "It's fine," David says. "She's looking out for you. That's admirable even if it's also kind of terrifying from my position." 10 minutes later, Mara appears beside the table with a question that sounds casual, but that David suspects is carefully calculated. "Mr. Chen, I'm curious. What made you agree to this dinner? My mother is Thessari military officer, your human civilian engineer. You work in different divisions at the facility. What made Ambassador Webb think you'd have enough common ground for social connection?" It's pointed question disguised as curiosity. She's testing whether David's interest in Kethara is genuine, or whether he's here out of obligation to Webb, or because dating an alien is novelty he wants to experience. "Honestly," David says, "I don't know what Webb was thinking when he arranged this. But I stayed after realizing it was a date rather than professional dinner because your mother is interesting to talk to. Because I appreciate her directness and her sense of humor about the awkward setup. And because anyone who can raise 6 daughters who are this competent and this protective is clearly someone worth getting to know better." Mara's skin shifts to contemplative blue. That's politically acceptable answer, but is it honest? "Yes," David says simply. "I could have left when I realized what this dinner actually was. I chose to stay. Not because Webb arranged it, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see whether the conversation we started would continue to be as engaging as the first 10 minutes suggested it might be." Mara nods slowly, processing his response. Acceptable for now. She returns to her observation position at the bar. "My daughters don't believe in subtle evaluation," Kethara observes. "They prefer direct questioning that makes their assessment criteria explicit rather than hidden." "I appreciate that actually," David says. "I'm terrible at reading subtle social cues. Direct questions I can answer honestly. Unspoken expectations I'll probably miss entirely and accidentally violate without meaning to." Throughout the dinner, the younger daughters employ their own evaluation tactics. Vela analyzes how David responds to the various interruptions, whether he shows irritation at having the dinner constantly disrupted, or whether he handles the complications with patience. Thessa observes whether he maintains engagement with Kethara despite the surveillance pressure, or whether the awareness of being watched makes him performative. Kira eventually approaches the table with her drawings. "Mr. Chen, would you like to see my art? I drew the garden and I drew our table and I drew you talking to Mother." "I'd love to see your drawings," David says, and Kira shows him each one with detailed explanation of what she was trying to capture. He listens attentively, asks genuine questions about her artistic choices, compliments specific elements that show skill or creativity. Kira returns to her table apparently satisfied with whatever she was testing through the interaction. "She was evaluating your kindness," Kethara explains. "Specifically whether you'd be dismissive of a child's interests or whether you'd give her genuine attention. You passed that assessment based on her skin colors when she returned to her table." "I wasn't trying to pass an assessment," David says. I was genuinely interested in her art. She's talented for 8 years old. That's why you passed, Kethara says. Because it was genuine interest rather than performed engagement designed to earn approval. As dinner progresses, David realizes something important. He can't earn these daughters' approval through social performance or through trying to impress them. They're too perceptive, too experienced with evaluating whether people are being authentic versus whether they're performing character they think will be favorably received. What they're looking for, what all 6 of them are testing for through their various tactics, is genuine sincerity. Honest responses, authentic character that remains consistent regardless of whether anyone is watching or approving. Confidence and smooth social skills won't earn their respect. Being honestly himself, imperfect, sometimes awkward but sincere, is what they're evaluating as worthy or unworthy of their mother's attention. It's intimidating in a completely different way than he initially expected. Not intimidating because he has to perform perfectly, but intimidating because he has to be genuinely himself and trust that who he genuinely is will be acceptable to 6 protective daughters, who have every right to be skeptical of strangers who might become part of their mother's life. The dinner continues. David stops trying to manage the daughter's perception and simply focuses on having honest conversation with Kethara about their work, their interests, the challenges and rewards of living in cross-cultural facility, the ways human and Thessari approaches to engineering and military service differ and complement each other. It's good conversation, the kind where time passes without awareness of it passing, where topics flow naturally from one to another, where both participants are genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement. And the 6 daughters continue watching, evaluating, determining whether this human who's having dinner with their mother is showing genuine character, or whether he's performing sincerity to earn approval. The turning point comes approximately 90 minutes into dinner, when Lyra's 30-minute waiting period has long expired, and she's apparently decided that she's been patient enough, and that her interrogation can no longer be delayed. She approaches the table with the direct, fearless manner that 7-year-olds specialize in when they have questions they consider important, and they don't understand why adults would waste time on polite delays. Mr. Chen, Lyra says, climbing into the chair beside David without invitation or preamble, I have important question. Lyra, Kethara says with the patient warning tone that parents use when their children are about to do something that's going to be embarrassing, but probably also impossible to prevent. We discussed waiting until after dinner. Dinner is almost finished, Lyra objects, gesturing at their mostly empty plates. And this is important question that I need to know the answer to before I decide if I like the human. Ask your question, Lyra, Kethara says, apparently recognizing that resistance is futile once Lyra has decided something is important. Lyra turns to David with the kind of direct, unfiltered assessment that only young children can deliver without self-consciousness or social performance. Do you think our mother is pretty just because she's different from humans, or do you actually like her? The question lands in the suddenly quiet dining area with devastating perceptiveness. It cuts through all the social performance, all the careful evaluation tactics, all the sophisticated assessment frameworks that her older sisters have been employing. It asks the fundamental question that underlies every interaction David's had tonight. Is his interest in Kethara genuine, or is it just curiosity about dating an alien? Is he attracted to who she actually is, or is he attracted to the novelty of cross-species romance? The 5 other daughters have all stopped their various activities. Seris is no longer pretending to read. Mara has turned from the bar to watch directly. Vela has moved closer to the windows. Thessa has paused her strategy game. Kira has set down her drawing materials. All 6 daughters are waiting for David's answer to the question that 7-year-old Lyra just asked with complete honesty and zero social filtering. Kethara's expression is carefully neutral, but her skin colors show that she's interested in his answer as well. That Lyra's blunt question has articulated something that was underlying the entire dinner, but that hadn't been stated so directly. David takes a moment to consider his response. Not because he needs to calculate what answer will earn approval, but because Lyra's question deserves honest answer, and he wants to articulate that honesty clearly. "I think your mother is beautiful," David says, speaking to Lyra, but aware that all 6 daughters and Kethara are listening. But the beauty comes from who she is, how she carries herself, how she speaks about her work and about all of you, how she's handling this extremely awkward dinner with humor and grace. Yes, she's different from humans, and yes, that difference is part of what makes her striking to look at. But I'm interested in her because of who she is, not because she's Thessari. He pauses. If I was just curious about dating an alien, I could have pursued that curiosity with any of the Thessari civilians who work at the facility. I'm here, having dinner with your mother specifically, because Ambassador Webb thought we'd get along well, and because the conversation we've been having for the past 90 minutes has been more genuinely engaging than most first dates I've experienced with humans. So yes, I think she's beautiful, but the beauty is about her character and personality, not just about her being different. Lyra studies him with the direct, unfiltered assessment that's apparently genetic across all 6 daughters regardless of age. Then she turns to her mother. "I like him, Mother. He gave honest answer and he didn't try to say what he thought I wanted to hear." She climbs down from the chair and returns to the play area, apparently satisfied that her interrogation has concluded successfully. The other 5 daughters show various skin colors that David has learned to interpret as processing and evaluation. Seris shows thoughtful blue mixed with what might be grudging approval. Mara shows analytical gold, suggesting she's incorporating this data point into her assessment framework. Vela, Thessa, and Kira all show colors that suggest favorable evaluation. Kethara's skin shows warm, amused gold. "Well, you've just passed my youngest daughter's direct assessment. That was the question she's been waiting all dinner to ask, and you gave her honest answer that she recognized as honest rather than as performance." "It was honest," David confirms. "Though I should mention that having 6 daughters evaluate whether I'm worthy of their mother's time and attention is possibly the most intimidating first date I've ever experienced. And I include the time I accidentally went on a date with someone who turned out to be my supervisor's daughter, and who informed me of that fact 30 minutes into dinner." Kethara laughs, genuine, warm laughter that transforms her expression from carefully controlled military authority to something more relaxed and human. Or rather, more relaxed and relatable despite the species difference. "My daughters are many things," she says. "Subtle is not one of them, but they're effective at determining whether people are being sincere. You've apparently passed their collective evaluation, or at least earned provisional approval pending further observation. Does that mean I can see you again without 6 chaperones present?" David asks. "Possibly," Kethara says. "Though I should warn you that if we continue seeing each other, my daughters will continue evaluating you. Just perhaps less overtly than tonight's surveillance operation." "I can live with that," David says. "As long as future evaluations don't involve Lyra asking devastatingly perceptive questions in front of entire restaurants." "I make no promises about what Lyra will or won't ask," Kethara replies. "She's 7. She has no filter and infinite curiosity, but I appreciate that you answered her honestly rather than deflecting or performing an answer you thought would earn approval." As they're preparing to leave, all 6 daughters gather around their mother, not surrounding David threateningly, but clearly present as unit, as family, as the protective collective that evaluated the human who had dinner with their mother, and apparently found him acceptable enough for provisional approval. "Mr. Chen," Seris says with formal precision that matches her mother's military bearing, "you may see our mother again. We'll be watching to determine whether tonight's apparent sincerity is consistent pattern, or whether it was performance designed to pass initial assessment. But you've earned the opportunity to demonstrate continued character. That's thank you, David says, uncertain whether he's being granted permission or being put on probation. It's both, Kethara says. Welcome to dating a Thessari military officer with 6 protective daughters. If you continue pursuing this connection, you'll be evaluated constantly, questioned regularly by the younger ones, and held to standards of honesty and character that most humans never experience in romantic contexts. And if I pass those evaluations, David asks, then you'll have earned the respect and trust of 6 daughters who don't grant either lightly, Kethara says, which is worth considerably more than any amount of smooth social performance or confident romantic pursuit could achieve. David looks at the 6 daughters, each unique, but all showing the protective competence that their mother has clearly instilled. I'll do my best to earn that trust honestly rather than trying to perform my way into it. Good answer, Mara says. We'll be watching to see if your behavior matches your stated intentions. Several weeks later, after multiple dinners, several family outings with various daughters present, and countless evaluations both overt and subtle, David reflects on the blind date that got complicated by 6 watchful daughters. Ambassador Webb, when David thanks him for the setup, smiles with the satisfied air of a diplomat whose matchmaking instincts proved sound. I thought you two would get along, and I thought the added complexity of Kethara's daughters would actually help rather than hinder. It would require you to be genuine rather than performative, and genuinely is when you're most likable. You could have warned me about the 6-daughter surveillance operation, David points out. If I'd warned you, you might have performed sincerity rather than actually being sincere, Webb replies. The fact that you didn't know you were being evaluated by 6 protective children meant you were just yourself, awkward, honest, genuinely interested in Kethara rather than trying to impress her. That authenticity is what earned their approval. So the blind date that got complicated was actually the point, David observes. The complication was the feature, not the bug, Webb confirms. Courage isn't always tested on battlefields or in formal courts. Sometimes it's tested across a dinner table, under 6 quiet stares, where honesty matters more than confidence and respect is earned one small moment at a time. You showed that kind of courage without knowing you were being tested for it. That's why Kethara's daughters approved of you, because your character was genuine rather than performed. David thinks about Lyra's devastating question. Do you think our mother is pretty just because she's different, or do you actually like her? Thinks about how he answered honestly rather than calculating what response would earn approval. Thinks about how 6 protective daughters evaluated every gesture, every word, every moment of a dinner that was supposed to be awkward blind date but became